My name's Adolfo Romero, and today I'm here with my colleague,
Ronan Hart.
and today is July 12th, 2023, and today I'm here on behalf of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program as part of the Challenging Racism at UF series project. And right now, who do I have the pleasure to be here with today?
Jon Sensbach. I'm the chair of the history department and professor of history.
All right, Mr. Sensbach. Well, thank you for making time today. I know you're a busy man out there doing a lot of great things within the university. And so just to begin, so I would like to know, when did you started working at UF and what made you decide to work at UF?
I got here in 1998, so I've been here 25 years. Before that, I was teaching at the University of Southern Mississippi in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And so when the job opportunity arose at UF, I applied for it because the UF's high academic reputation was well known at the time, and so I thought it would be a good place to go, and so have been here ever since.
Okay. Can you tell me about your impression of starting off at UF, and what was the reality? Was the reality different when you actually came over and started working here?
Well, I had been teaching, as I said, at the University of Southern Mississippi, and so I was well attuned to life on a college campus, a public college campus. The Southern Miss was a good bit smaller than UF, about 15,000 students. And so when I got here, of course, UF was much bigger. The student body was a little bit different. At Southern Miss, it was a heavily first-gen school. So I had a lot of students, first-generation college and their families. At UF, the reality was a little bit different. The students were probably better prepared, I think, for college work. So there was that difference. But I think overall, I was pretty used to the way public universities work, and be responsible to state legislatures and to a different kind of constituency than a private institution. I did my doctoral work at Duke University, private university, and so it was a different thing going to a public, and I think in a lot of ways a better thing, because you feel like you're reaching a broader diversity of students. You're reaching students, from a diversity of backgrounds, and I like that. I've always liked that about public universities. And so UF was just a small city within a city. But I also learned that within my small world in the history department and sort of the around the Plaza of the Americas and the library, it was actually kind of a smallish community. And so you don't feel overwhelmed all the time by vast size.
Mm-hmm. So that kind of answers the next question that we have about, why did you want to, what has kept you in your position for as long as you've been here? Or are there any other reasons?
Well, as I say, I think that, the mission of a public university is a special thing. And in our country's educational history and in the way our society is structured now. I think, the future of education lies in public universities, with all the attention given to what's going on at the Ivies and small elite colleges in New England. The reality is that the bulk of people who get a college education are vastly dominated by education instruction at the public university level, and so that I've always been attracted to that, and I feel like if you're going to a career in higher education, you have a chance to do the most good teaching and instructing at a university of the public university, where you can reach a broader diversity of students, where you have a broader diversity of experiences, and you have a chance to have a bigger impact. So that's what's kept me here.
Yeah, absolutely. So we learned from Adrienne Martinez that at some point you taught a class that gave students the opportunity to do research into UF's history. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, how did you get interested in that subject? How did that class come about? And what was the experience of kind of seeing students do that research?
Yeah. Well, it was in 2018, I think it was, that I was fortunate to teach a class on slavery and public memory in the United States. And I had some very bright and talented students in that class. And so we were looking at ways in which slavery is acknowledged, not acknowledged, studied, disregarded, ignored, whatever, in the United States today. And one of the students there, Gabriella Paul, did her research paper on the ways that universities have begun to trace their lineages and their linkages back to slavery. And there's some very well-known examples there: Georgetown University, University of Virginia, Brown University, Harvard, and others. And so she did her paper on that. And in the course of, and so students had to give their final presentations at the end of the year. And in the course of Gabriella giving her paper, we started talking generally as a class, well, has anybody ever done such a study for UF? And we couldn't think of any. We didn't know of any such research. We were aware that universities across the country were doing similar things, but we couldn't think of anybody doing any kind of research like that here. So at the very end of the class, I approached Gabriella and several other students, Ahmad Brown, Javier Escoto Garcia, and Morgan Peltier. These were 4 students who were very interested in that subject. And I asked them if they would be willing to participate in an independent study the next semester, which would have been spring of 2019, an independent study looking at that very question: what extent, if any, does UF owe its existence to slavery? And so they readily agreed, and we worked it out. We set out a meeting time on a weekly basis in the spring of 2019, and they started doing their research. And so that was the genesis of that project. And in the course of their research, they found that the University of Florida, which traces its origins to 1853, did indeed have very strong linkages to slavery, in that a lot of the cotton planters who came down here from South Carolina and Georgia in the 1840s and 1850s brought enslaved laborers with them. They were able to get land here in Central Florida through something called the Armed Occupation Act, which was an act of Congress which made land available that had been seized from the Seminole Indians after their defeat in the Second Seminole War. Their land became available, or was simply reappropriated and essentially stolen by the U.S. government and sold to these cotton planters. The proceeds from that sale of land went into what was called a seminary fund, and that fund created the East Florida Seminary, which was the forerunner institution to the University of Florida. So there's a direct connection between the dispossession of Seminole land, the sale of that land to cotton planters, and the cotton planters who then formed and were on the board, and whose children then went to the East Florida Seminary in Ocala in the 1850s, all the way up to the end of the Civil War. So there was a direct connection. And through their research, the students found that the board members of the East Florida Seminary were all slaveholders, that the students who went there came from slaveholding families, and so slaveholding enriched these families and led directly to the education and the establishment of the seminary. And so we were able to make, or I should say the students through their research were able to make that connection and to find that, like these other institutions that I mentioned earlier, Virginia, Clemson, University of North Carolina, Georgia, all of which had deep-seated connections to slavery, UF was very much in the same kind of boat. So that was the conclusion of their research. And I'd like to think that research proved a kind of a foundation building block for further research that they went on. And the beauty of it, to my mind, was that this is exactly the kind of project that undergraduate students need to be involved in. From the start, it was a student-directed project. I helped them, I steered them in certain directions, but at the end of the day, they were the ones that did the research, they wrote the report, put it together. It was their conclusions then upon which their report is based, and which we now can say with confidence that yes, the University of Florida, unfortunately, has undeniable links to the institution of slavery, like so many other colleges and universities across the country.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. What is the importance of memory in learning the history of one's own university? What are the implications by doing this work that you've done?
Well, I think the implications are that as institutions face up to their history and learn where they actually come from, that if we understand that the wealth of a particular institution and the prestige, let's take the University of Florida, the prestige of a powerful billion-dollar institution like the University of Florida is today, didn't get that way overnight. It came from very modest beginnings. The East Florida Institute was a seminary. It was only fewer than 100 students. Okay, but if you think that the origins of an institution like that are grounded in another institution that we are rightly now finding was at the heart of American economic system. American capitalism in the 19th century was rooted firmly in slavery, that there are connections between less savory aspects of our history to a present identity and a series of policies which have, over the years, through the 20th century into the 21st century, has proven to be less equitable and less accepting to a broader constituency and a broader population, which may very well be and probably is a direct reflection of its origins in slavery, racial exclusion, economic inequality, inequality of opportunity. And so those detriments, those negative aspects of say, UF's origins within the history of slavery have a direct reflection then on the current complexion, on the current structuring of a powerful modern university like UF is.
Okay. Do you feel that there should be perhaps maybe some reparations or provide something to reach equity, provide some, I don't know if it's monetary, if it's policy that needs to be provided so the individuals that started up behind, because obviously one group had more advantage over the years, how can we reach that link between the past and now to make it more equitable for students in our current times?
Yeah, that's a complicated question and a loaded one. To give one example, Georgetown University, which is perhaps the most famous example nowadays because Georgetown sold 272 slaves, as you probably know, in the 1830s to help recuperate its debts and to stay afloat economically. After a lot of research, Georgetown University now has offered a kind of reparations by offering, as I understand it, offering admission, tuition-free admission to the university of the descendants of those enslaved people who were sold, okay, nearly 200 years ago. Okay, Georgetown is a private university, they can do that. Okay, we are a public university, we can't do that. Okay, it's made even more complicated, obviously, by the recent Supreme Court ruling about affirmative action, which now outlaws consideration of race in admissions. Presumably that a similar kind of prohibition would apply as well to considerations of race when it comes time to reparations. Discussions about reparations are going on in many venues. You may be aware that the state of California has now passed, I think, legislation or is considering legislation that would offer reparations to descendants of Black Californians who can show that they were victimized by racial exclusion, Jim Crow, slavery and so on. Those discussions obviously have not taken place in Florida yet. So I think the challenge is going to be at an institution like the University of Florida, if a direct form of reparations that is not based on racial considerations is made illegal, by extension under the Supreme Court ruling, then what, if any, form of reparations can there be if you can't consider race? So that's a discussion for the lawyers to take, and one that I would be interested to follow and certainly take part in. But just to take the example of affirmative action, I've been here long enough to know that to have been around when affirmative action was unilaterally ended here in the state of Florida by then Governor Jeb Bush, who just simply said affirmative action is outlawed in the state of Florida. So the Supreme Court ruling is nothing new to us here in Florida. We've been living that reality for 20 years. But I also remember distinctly that the year after affirmative action was abolished here, that enrollment of minority students was essentially halved, went from about 15% to about 7%. So, I mean, we can all see the consequences here, and it's never rebounded. It's stayed about the same. 7% of African Americans, I think roughly the same for Latinx students and other less represented groups. So what is the solution for that? And I don't think there is an easy solution. But I think that what you're doing here with the oral history, these kinds of projects, and the research that's been going on is a first step toward acknowledging that there is a historical basis for inequality and that institutions are responsible for trying to find ways to make amends for those past injustices in ways that are both legal but also that offer redress to certain populations in this country that have been historically excluded and discriminated against and who still need access to equal opportunity that a university can afford. So that's a long-winded way of saying I don't know exactly what the debate on reparations is going to be, but I do still firmly believe that some form of redress is desirable and, if not required, by a modern university in its stated goal to provide equitable opportunity to education and opportunity that should be the hallmark of a university.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's excellent, especially bringing in the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action and considering that in Florida and at UF is something we wanted to ask about because we have a separate project, the Black Faculty Recruitment and Retention Project at UF, that is grant funded by UF to kind of explore the problems and failures when it comes to recruiting and retaining Black faculty and students at UF. So I'm curious if, in your view, having been here long enough to kind of see that process that you were just talking about, you know, what are some of the reasons that's something UF struggles with? What are the reasons that Black faculty don't want to stay here or want to move on? You know, if that is a question you're able to answer.
Well, yeah, in my years here, the percentage of Black faculty has always been relatively low compared to other institutions I'm familiar with. Of course, we might anticipate that it's going to get even worse in the aftermath of recent legislation at the state level, restricting the teaching of diversity, equity, and inclusion, eliminating DEI programs, and so on. But yes, the problem has always been here, even well before this current bout of legislation. One can only speculate about the reasons why that might be. Failure by the administration to reach out and actively recruit minority faculty, a sense that, well, in the aftermath, perhaps of the decline of the minority student population after the elimination of affirmative action, that may very well have had repercussions as well. That once the percentage of, Black and Latinx and other students dropped precipitously, that may well have had a negative effect on faculty recruitment. Whether the University of Florida is perceived as being undesirable or hostile to minority faculty, I can only speculate on that. But traditionally, I think it has been harder to recruit minority faculty, to a predominantly and historically white institution, if it can't be shown that there's a sustained commitment to that kind of recruitment, and that you can build a core of Black faculty. Since I've been here, university administrators have never expressed a hostility to it, and I believe that they've been genuinely sincere in their desire to recruit and build Black faculty base and retention and so on. And I believe that sincerity has been real, but it's been difficult to show results in the field from, say, a core, like initiatives that would result in a hiring of a core of 8, 10, 15, 20 faculty at a time, where you can say, look, we're really making strides in this. We've got a substantial core of Black faculty or Latinx faculty. I've not seen those kinds of results. It's one here, one there. With the hiring of Dave Canton in African American Studies several years ago, I think we're seeing a renewed commitment to doing that, and he's been successful in recruiting several faculty to African American Studies, and the hope is, of course, that that's going to become its own department soon. So we're starting to see some movement there, but again, as I say, the effects of recent legislation may very well prove a new detriment to the kind of active recruitment that we really need here.
I was going to get back to the report.
Yeah.
So first of all, with the research report done by the undergraduate students in 2018 or 2019, with that, did that make much of a splash? Was there any kind of attention drawn by that report?
There were several newspaper articles in Gainesville Sun, which at that time still published stories about UF on a regular basis, and so there were several stories about that. Their research was actually published in this student research journal, Alpata, which is put out by the university history department, and their article, Slavery in the University of Florida, African Americans, Seminoles, and the Origins of Higher Education in Florida, created a brief stir. It was read, I think, by some faculty and administrators. And as I say, I think that it proved a kind of foundation work for the task force report that came on the year after that. But I think that we're still waiting for. I think that we're still waiting for more widespread acknowledgement by the upper administration about the importance of this research, about the implications, about directions for future research. You said that you've talked to Adrian Martinez, who's been very instrumental in trying to get the university to join the University Studying Slavery Consortium. She's very determined, she's very dogged, she wants to see this happen. But we've not, to my knowledge, had any acknowledgement by the upper administration that this is something that they want to do, or that this is on anybody's radar or anybody's agenda, anything like that. So I think that the implications of this report and of the task force report are still waiting to be fully acknowledged and digested and seriously thought about by the upper administration here at the university, to see whether, if any, action should be taken to make turn history into an action program leading to better equity opportunities for populations that have been historically denied those chances. Mm-hmm. So, long answer to your question is, or the short answer I should say is, there's a world of impact still waiting to be acted upon and discovered in this report and the other that waiting still to happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, it definitely seems like, UF did make a big step when they initiated creating this task force to create this report. Yeah. Was that a surprise to you when that happened? What was the circumstance surrounding that?
Well, I think, and as you say, I agree that there was a big step, an important step, and I think it was perhaps an acknowledgement of the work that had been done by those 4 undergraduate students earlier. But these kinds of steps were being taken across the country in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder and Breonna Taylor and others in the summer of 2020, and so the creation of that task force, while a much needed and very desirable step, was very much in keeping with the spirit of the times. 3 years ago now, it seems longer in the sense that much of the impetus for the Black Lives Matter movement has been lost or squandered. There's obvious backlash against it, and I think we might probably agree that the recent Supreme Court rulings are a form of backlash against it. But at the time, going back to your question, those were the circumstances, and there were protest movements in the street, and so then President Fox, I think, took the courageous step of saying, okay, look, we have some facing up to do as an institution, we have some historical reckoning to do, let's get a task force together to find out the extent to which UF and its origins and its historical background were implicated in slavery, racism, Jim Crow, dispossession of Native American territories, all of those things that the original report broached, but then carrying on that research into the rest of the 19th century, up to the creation of UF in 1905, and then the development of UF as a regional state university through the 20th century and into its current period of building a strong national reputation. That research has needed to be done, and that report, if you've had a chance to look at it, is firm in its conclusions that in the 160 years or so, I guess it's 160 years now, isn't it, of, where's 170? 1853 to 2023, 170 years of its existence, that the University of Florida, like many, many universities across the South and across the country, has been deeply implicated in historical, racial, and economic inequities. And if we are to make some kind of a connection between historical past and the present and the potential of the university to make good on its promise in the future, that some form of redress is unavoidable, in my opinion. So that's a long-winded way of saying that's to recreate the spirit of the times now, 2023 in 2020, 3 years ago, that there was a lot of optimism at that point that we don't know what the future is going to bring, but historical research is a solid foundation upon which to base policy decisions in the future. We have yet to see any movement that is going to make that link between historical research and any sort of policy decisions. So I think this new administration under President Sass has a terrific opportunity to do that. If they choose to accept that opportunity, we shall see.
Mm-hmm.
When writing the report during the process, did you face any hostility or even the board, the university, hey, you can't write about this or that, or was it a smooth process putting the task force report together?
Yes, it was. No hostility or or resentment or any kind of impediments were put in our way. As far as we understood our mission from President Fox, we took it upon ourselves to look to go where the research took us, and so we spent many months in the archives doing research, looking at newspaper articles, looking at files in the university archives, looking at documents. We felt, or I felt anyway, a complete carte blanche to go where the research took us, and no hostility at all. So from that regard, I felt the university was supportive in what we were trying to do. I think that the aftermath, though, of the report and its publication left something to be desired. President Fox, while giving him full credit for initiating the report and forming the task force, to my knowledge, didn't seem all that interested in the results, never really gave us a public endorsement. And it was at that period when he himself had announced his decision to step down. And I think we were in the early stages of forming presidential search committees and going through the process that eventually resulted in the hiring of President Sass. But I felt a hesitancy on then President Fox's part during that period to say, well, any decisions that might come out of this or any action that might come out of this report are going to be the new president's responsibility, and I'm not going to really weigh in on it at this point. And that would include a decision to join the University Studying Slavery Consortium. It was during that period that Adrian was constantly contacting President Fox's office saying, hey, what about it? And he was like, nah, sorry, not gonna go there. So again, we're in a holding pattern, a waiting pattern to see if this is anything that the president and administration is going to be interested in.
Okay, so I have heard a lot of the team members that have written the report. They have gone to different conferences to present the report. How has that experience been? Have other universities or other groups thought about the same thing doing in their university? Have they become motivated to sort of like dive down into their own history, legacy of exclusion, whatever it may be?
Absolutely, yeah. And I did go to one of those conferences at the University of Virginia last year, and it was really kind of exhilarating because you got to talk to lots of faculty and students and others from colleges and universities around the country who were doing this kind of research. And as I said, that when we started this research in the 2018 and 2019, we had the feeling that we were behind the curve, that all these other colleges were way ahead of us and they were doing this research and we were not doing it. Well, now we are at the point where others are approaching us, and we had conversations at a conference at UVA last year of people who were really impressed by what we had come up with, because Adrian gave a presentation and I gave a presentation, and we got to share ideas with people from around the country, and this is how we did it, and how did you go about it, and what did you learn, and what, if anything, is your university doing with it? And a lot of them there's a common thread there. Well, it's easy to do the research. It's one thing to do the research, but then acting upon it and coming up with concrete policy resolutions is something else. An administration may give lip service to the idea of, well, yes, we have to face up to these hard truths, and we need to do the research and let the research lead us where it may, but then to actually say, okay, this is some pretty hard stuff you're coming up with. We see that the economic origins of our university are fully tied up with the institution of slavery. What, if anything, can we do about it now in the year 2022, 2023? And that's a hard question to answer. and most of them really aren't. Unless they are a private institution that has the resources and the legal wherewithal to say, we are going to take racial considerations and descendant considerations into effect, to say we owe something to the descendants of the people that we enslaved. We're going to give scholarships, or we're going to make a special fund available, or whatever it may be. Barring that, my sense is that most public institutions aren't facing up to it to the extent that they would or should. The University of Virginia is one example where they've done you may be aware of this magnificent new monument that they've created, the monument to the enslaved laborers on the campus at the University of Virginia. The University of Virginia was more deeply implicated in slavery than probably most of them anywhere. They've identified about 5,000 enslaved people who helped build the university, who made the bricks, the woodwork, who did all kinds of construction work and other kinds of labor to make the University of Virginia possible. So now they have a magnificent monument to those enslaved laborers there. And that's a concrete step that universities can take. Some of them are building statues, some of them are renaming buildings. They're doing other kinds of things. Much of it's symbolic, but at least something to acknowledge that there's a link between the past and the present. I think that hard work is still yet to be done at UF. We haven't seen a lot of buildings renamed.
Right.
We haven't seen any statues. Okay, so we're still at that stage, yeah.
Okay. So one factor, I guess one question I had, based off the report, what is one of the most impressive facts that you learned as you were digging through all this information and doing this research investigation? What was something that surprised you or that captivated your attention?
I wouldn't say this came as a surprise necessarily, but the thing that fascinated me most about it was that the university's origins in this small institution, the East Florida Seminary, from the post-1865 period up until the founding in the University of Florida in 1905, that 40-year period, that the East Florida Seminary and a sister institution, the Florida Agricultural College, Lake City, which merged with the East Florida Seminary to form University of Florida, that those institutions grew and flourished and prospered at a time when hopes for African American democratic participation in the political process first appeared to wax and be full of hopeful optimism, and then to come crashing down in 1877 with the end of Reconstruction, the rise of racial violence, the rise of the Jim Crow era, so that these two things went hand in hand, that higher education from very small beginnings began to take off and flourish second half of the 19th century into the early 20th century at exactly the moment when opportunities for Black Floridians began to crater, and they were disenfranchised, they were blocked out of participation in the political process, and they were terrorized by racial violence every day. So there's a connection there in my mind, and that the University of Florida embodies that connection, and that embodies, in my mind, the sense of how it is that opportunities for Floridians to gain access to equal opportunity in education have never been equal. And again, establishing the connection between the history and the present, the good example of Florida Agricultural and Mechanical, FAMU, aside, I mean, that was the Black institution of higher education established in the late 19th century for Black students, but it was an unequal educational experience, poorly funded. It educated generations of Black students, to be sure, but it was never considered an equal an equal institution. And so for that institution to have produced outstanding generations of black graduates through the years has been a very impressive accomplishment. And the same could be said for all HBCUs, that they've succeeded despite inadequate opportunities, inadequate funding, inadequate resources, all of that. Okay, so so that to me was the principal lesson of this. I think the second thing was to see once integration was achieved in Florida, starting in the late 1950s, early 1960s, how once the black student population began slowly to increase, how they became much more vocal, much more determined to press for equal rights, equal opportunities, for the creation of a African American Studies program, as they did. So you go from an institution which has no black students at all to an institution that has a few black students to an institution that has an increasing number of black students, still not enough, obviously, but how those students have become increasingly a larger and more vocal and more perceptible part of the educational experience here at the university. And to chart that from the 1850s from an institution grounded in slavery to the present day, where black students, despite not being enough of the student body as they should be, are still a powerful vocal presence on campus. And that to me has been an uplifting part of the story.
Okay. Yeah, no, it makes me think with the trajectory from where you're saying like Reconstruction, and then we have the Jim Crow, but in between you have eugenics being taught at UF. So, it doesn't open the door for black people or anybody of color at that point.
Right.
All the way till 1960s and 70s, where you start having a few students, but nonetheless we do have a few of them. And then we're here now in today's time, 7%, it's not a big number. Right. Where do we go from here? I guess that's something to think about. How do we find, right now with the political climate and everything, it's even more difficult. I felt like in 2019 we had a chance, 2018, to talk about this issues, bring it up, and perhaps create some change. But right now with legislation, Supreme Court, everything that's been going on with CRT, you name it, it's just like thing after thing, diversity, inclusion departments getting impacted by everything that's happening. Right. It's like, it feels like we took a step forward, but then we went 2 steps back. So what does that mean for like the future of diversity within the university?
Yeah. That's it's just. I mean, if you have, it raises some troubling questions, because if you have state legislation now outlawing offices of DEI and explicitly outlawing instruction that touches on themes of DEI, what do you have? If you can't, does that mean that the state of Florida now is officially against inclusion, against diversity? I mean, that's the way I interpret the law. I mean, why not just say, education for whites only? I mean, why don't they just come out and say it? That seems to be the intent. Of course, they would never say that, but that seems to be the intent of the law. So it raises very troubling questions, and I think that there's an opportunity for the new administration to step up and forcefully defend equal opportunity and freedom of speech and freedom of academic inquiry at the university level. And I think we're still waiting to hear that.
Yeah, and that's very interesting, at least with President Sass, kind of like just being quiet about silence. Silence is a very powerful tool, and not even attending events, when it comes to diversity events or anything like that. Yeah. And we don't see much of that even in today's time. So I don't know, I want to be hopeful, but at the same time, it's just reality for what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
You know, it's already been almost, how long? Almost a year or a couple months? Yeah.
A few months.
A few months.
Yeah, six or eight months, something like that, yeah.
You would expect by now, like, you know, there would have been a little bit more speech or more wording about what's going on, but...
Yeah, you would think, so...
I wanted to ask, what projects are you currently working outside of the task force report in regards to race issues? I mean, I'm not even sure if you're able to work on race-related issues or projects.
Or anything else related to UF and UF's history.
Right.
Let's see here. As far as UF's history, nothing at the moment. My own field of research and specialty is the colonial period, the American Revolutionary period. I do a lot of research on slavery in the Caribbean, in the American South. So I'm working on several projects like that. I'm particularly, right now I'm working on a relationship of religion and race during the American Revolution and exploring ways in which enslaved people used religion to as a form of resistance against slavery. At the time that the nation was being founded and the Constitution being drafted and the Three-Fifths Compromise being put into play, pressures on black people were getting more and more severe, obviously, during that period. The obvious disparity, the dichotomy between a nation supposedly founded on principles of freedom and yet the dramatic expansion of the slavery regime starting in the 1790s and into the early part of the 19th century, which ultimately enfolded Florida into it in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, has always fascinated me. And so I'm interested in the way religion was used by enslaved people as a form of spiritual empowerment and a form of resistance to slavery. So that's what I've spent my career working on, basically. So I'm still working on that.
Excellent, yeah. So in light of a lot of the things that we've discussed relating to black faculty recruitment and retention at UF, UF's history, it's the current direction that it feels like it's moving in that, you know, can be a little scary in how it's not addressing these issues. In your view, how can faculty and staff stand together to address these issues, you know, maybe on top of or outside of this kind of research? What are the duties or obligations of faculty and staff in a situation like this when they can perceive that things are going in this certain direction?
Well, from a pedagogical standpoint, well, what we can do is to insist that we will teach our history to the best of our ability and to face up to the realities about racism and slavery and inequality and so on that are that must be confronted and taught in American history. There's no way around it. You can't teach American history without confronting those things, and I think our faculty are determined to keep doing that, whatever the laws say. That said, you know, some people are feeling vulnerable about what the limits are, whether there's going to be policing in the classroom, whether there's going to be students tape recording their lectures and editing them from a selective basis and posting, you know, out of context material online or whatever. So yeah, sure, there's concern about that, and that particularly graduate students who teach classes or are TAs in classes. Sure, there's concern there, and we have to work with them to do that. Second thing is that faculty don't have a lot of power when it comes to decision making at the upper administration levels, obviously, but we can help shape the hiring that we do by identifying certain fields that we need to have covered, and to identify fields that may be more likely to attract faculty of color. So, for example, African American Studies in the past couple of years, they've hired faculty. Alyssa Cole is now a faculty member in our department, although her appointment is in African American Studies. Her tenure home is in the history department. I think we can shape hiring priorities in our department to say, well, look, it's important that we cover certain aspects, and so we're going to hire to meet those aspects, and we may get a more diverse pool of applicants that way, whom we can hire, who might very well contribute to our diversity. So there are things that we can do, and we have to be outspoken, I think, and united as a faculty to be able to do that. It's easier said than done because faculties have lots of hiring needs. For example, we don't have anybody who teaches Native American history at this point. Okay, so if we advertise for a position in Native American history, great, but we're not. That field is still dominated by non-native, non-indigenous scholars. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but we're not guaranteed to get a Native American scholar there. Same thing if we were to advertise a position in 19th century African American history. We may get some good applications from a broad pool of applicants, but there's no guarantee that we'll be able to hire an African American faculty member, for example. So there are things that we can do, but there are certain limitations on what we can do as well. So that's about the extent of it. And just to be, outspoken on our commitment to teaching honest history the best way we can, in which we are resolved not to shy away from controversial topics just because the state of Florida passes some laws that says you can't teach that and you can't teach this. So we have to maintain our resolve, I think, in academic freedom and our inherent right to teach the way we see it.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic answer, and I do not have any other questions right now. Do you have anything else?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
Well, before we wrap up, do you have any other closing thoughts, anything else you want to put on the record related to this?
No, I guess I would say that there's every reason to be discouraged by recent legislation, both at the Supreme Court or I should say at the Florida state level of legislation and at the Supreme Court level of jurisprudence. There's lots of reasons to become pessimistic and to understand that we are in a period of backlash. But taking the long view, as a historian, we understand that American history is full of such periods of backlash. I think you said earlier 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or maybe it was 1 step forward and 2 steps back, okay? And it certainly feels like we're taking a step back now. But I think that if there's any reason to be optimistic, looking at American history as a guide, we can say that this period is nothing new in that regard, and that after a period of backlash, there's inevitably going to be a period of resurgence for progressive beliefs, for a sense of justice and equality and opportunity. And there'll be a period of backlash against that too, okay? But there's going to be a period when the backlash begins to recede and people can continue to strive for a broader vision of equality that we're still looking for. So I just would urge people to bear that in mind, to say that for all the reasons to be pessimistic and down in the dumps about things, that there's reason for optimism as well.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sensbach.
Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Thanks for the conversation, and thank you for your probing questions.